I have received a letter from the honourable member for McMahon proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely, the Prime Minister's plan to make Australians and their families pay for his broken promises. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places. I call the honourable member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We've heard a lot of speculation in recent weeks about how the role model for this budget was the 1996 Peter Costello budget, about how Peter Costello was the intellectual godfather of this particular budget, and how the John Howard government was the role model for this government. I don't think that's quite right, with due respect, Madam Speaker. I think it goes back further. I think the role model was the 1979 mini-budget, which inspired this famous headline. This famous headline in the 1979 mini-budget, Madam Speaker, which could equally apply to this budget delivered by the Treasurer last night, because this budget shows more effectively than anything else that the last election campaign waged by the Prime Minister and Treasurer was one of systematic and wilful deceit of the Australian people. Systematic and wilful deceit of the Australian people, because the Prime Minister and Treasurer knew that if they told the Australian people in September what they were planning in this budget, then the Australian people would have been a lot less likely to vote for them. On that basis, they campaigned for office on a web of deceit. They promised the Australian people cost of living relief. That is not what they delivered last night. They promised the Australian people they could return the budget to surplus with no new taxes and no cuts to spending over and above what they'd already announced. That was always voodoo economics, and we now know it was deceit as well. It was more than voodoo economics. It was willful and systematic misleading of the Australian people. They told the Australian people many things. At last September's election, Madam Speaker, never before has so much been promised to so many people by so few as was promised by the Prime Minister and Treasurer, and never before has so much been reneged on as it was in last night's budget. This is a budget of broken regard for the Australian people and their right to insist on political accountability in this nation. This was a budget which was cynical when it comes to dealing with election promises. This was a budget which introduced new taxes which the Prime Minister of Australia solemnly swore he would never introduce, that the Treasurer of Australia solemnly promised the Australian people would never happen. Cuts to family payments, cuts to hospital funding, cuts to schools, which they both said would never happen on their watch. Now, this budget is so fundamentally misleading that I must confess, Madam Speaker, it is difficult to choose where to start. It could be Medicare, it could be family payments, it could be fuel tax, but I'm going to start on the $80 billion worth of cuts to schools and hospitals. $80 billion worth of cuts to schools and hospitals. This will affect frontline services that are so important to the Australian people. Oh, that's what Australia really needs at the moment, cuts to schools and hospitals. We need more schools closing, according to the government. We need less services in our hospitals. And we saw the Treasurer last night, arrogantly, on the 7:30 report. He had a shocker on the 7:30 report, I must say, Deputy Speaker, but this particular part was very bad. He was asked about the impact of the cuts on the service deliveries of the states. This is what he had to say. Very profound. It's up to them. It's up to them, he said to his state and territory colleagues. Well, they've given him a free character assessment today, Madam Speaker. The Premiers and Treasurers of Australia's well-known socialists, Campbell Newman, said, "I'm afraid it's a non-transparent and upfront way of dealing with that, and it's very disappointing. We're calling on an emergency COAG." I've got to say, Madam Speaker, when Campbell Newman says you've cut too much, you know you've got a problem. There's only one budget emergency in this country, and it's the budget emergency of the states and territories caused by the Treasurer last night, Madam Speaker. He has caused the Premiers of New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria to condemn his budget because they know the types of cuts that this will lead to in schools and hospitals. Or, alternatively, they will need an alternative source of revenue. They will need a different type of funding. I wonder what that type of funding might be, Madam Speaker. Maybe a Commonwealth tax that gets distributed to the states, known as the Goods and Services Tax. As sure as night follows day, we're going to see premiers and state treasurers calling for an increase in the rate of the GST or a broadening in the base. In the meantime, they'll have to cut and cut to the bone. We will see schools closed, make no mistake. We will see hospital services reduced, make no mistake. There is no alternative, Madam Speaker. A state treasurer, with all due respect to them, Labor or Liberal, could not find collectively $80 billion over the next 10 years without massive cuts to services. This is a Prime Minister who said no cuts to health and no cuts to education, and that's 80 billion broken promises to the Australian people. Yeah. And then we move to Medicare. Now, Madam Speaker, Medicare happens to be very dear to members on this side of the House because Labor created it and Labor will defend it. We will defend it in this House. We will defend it in the other place. We will defend it in the community, and we will fight and fight and fight for universal health care in this country. And the Treasurer might not think that $7 is much money. He might say it's a cup of coffee or a cigar, perhaps, just picking commodities at random that people can give up in terms of what they could give up to pay to go for the doctor. But there are a lot of families for whom $7 to go to the doctor if they have a sick child or a number of sick children or have to pay for medicine is a lot of money. And we've seen the medical fraternity point out the impacts of these cuts on health services right across the country. There will be Australians who decide they simply cannot afford to go to the doctor. And there are two fundamental principles here, Madam Speaker. Firstly, your wealth should not determine your health. And the health of any single Australian should be the concern of every Australian. And if this government gets its way, there will no longer be universal health care in Australia. Medicare will be trashed, but we will not let it happen, Madam Speaker. We will stand in defence of Medicare. We will fight for Medicare and we will fight for universal health care. The Prime Minister says he's the best friend Medicare ever had. Well, I'd hate to see an enemy, because on his watch, if he gets his way, he will destroy Medicare, make no mistake. He will remove universal health care in Australia, but we will not let him do it. And then we have other examples, Mr Deputy Speaker. We have the new taxes. We saw the Treasurer dancing through the raindrops at question time, saying, "Oh, I didn't actually say that." Well, there's a few million viewers who might recall that he did. We have the fuel levy, the indexation of the fuel excise. I mean, the Prime Minister, you might recall, did a bit of travelling over the last 3 years, went around the country talking about the impacts of a carbon price on cost of living, promised that he would restore support for cost of living by dealing with the carbon price. He just forgot to mention that they were going to change the fuel indexation at the same time. I can see people pulling at the service station. They might choose BP. They'll be filling up and they'll say, "BP, broken promise. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Abbott." A broken promise to every Australian driver. This is the Prime Minister who says, terrible to tax polluters, and you wouldn't want to tax mining companies, but geez, taxing families, taxing drivers, now there's a good idea. Why don't we do that? Now, Madam Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is a fundamental principle I think is important in politics. You hold people to their own tests. You hold people to what they said. They set the bar and then you hold them to it. The Prime Minister promised something different. He promised that he would uphold every single promise he made. Now we have the core, non-core dance of the Seven Veils, where he says, "Oh, there's an overarching promise." Well, there are fundamental promises. We've heard it from the front bench, we've heard it from the back bench. We've had the denial, the pathetic denial that there are any election promise breaches in this budget. Mr Deputy Speaker, if a government breaks a promise, just fess up to the Australian people. Just be honest with the Australian people and say it was too hard. We weren't up to it. It's all harder than we thought. We got it wrong. You might at least get a bit of respect for that. But this pathetic denial of reality we see from the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, this pathetic denial of the Australian people, which is going down so badly with the Australian people who feel insulted at the antics of the Prime Minister and Treasurer. We saw even in question time today refusing to acknowledge they had breached a promise. Well, they have breached promises, but they've also effectively attempted to attack the social fabric of this nation. They have attempted to dismantle Medicare. They have attempted, after all their rhetoric, to take $3,000 off single-income families with a child of 7 years old, because they get so much cheaper when they turn 7, Mr Deputy Speaker, as opposed to 6. That just shows how fundamentally out of touch this Prime Minister and Treasurer are. Well, we'll continue to hold them to account, we'll continue to hold them to their promises, and we'll continue to point out their fundamental dishonesty.